Buon pomeriggio, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to our tea corner. The opportunity to spend 30 minutes together drinking a cup of tea at the same time with the possibility to have a conversation on sustainability topics. Today we have Stefano Clara with us. Stefano leads the ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, in particular three main pillars in relation to the technical dialogue, the sharing and of the knowledge and the capacity building. And so I don't want to spend too much time, Stefano, and the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you, Daniele, and thanks to Lorenzo and the whole Equilibria team for the invite. And it's a pleasure to be here. So I'll be telling you a few more words about ICAP and about the topic we work on in a second. In the meantime, I'll try to pull up the slides. Hope you can see them okay. What I was invited to do today was to give you a bit of an overview of what is happening and what is the state of play for the implementation of emission trading systems worldwide. As a note of context, the organizational workforce, so ICAP, is an international partnership that brings together more than 40 governments worldwide that get together on the ICAP to jointly work on the design and implementation of emission trading systems. So I guess you might be familiar already with the concept of carbon pricing. I wanted to say a couple of words about ICAP, also to provide context on the presentation that I'm about to give, because ICAP by mandate focuses on compliance emission trading systems. And just as a quick note of background and to make sure that we're all on the same page, when it comes to compliance carbon pricing instruments, we typically find either carbon taxes or emission trading systems. Both carbon pricing instruments, as you would imagine, end up putting a price on CO2 emissions, but they do that in two quite different ways. Under a carbon tax, the price level is... Okay. I was about to say, just to provide a quick context on the discussion today. So in terms of compliance carbon pricing instruments, you will find carbon taxes and emission trading systems. What carbon taxes do is that they fix a price on CO2 emissions, but you don't have certainty on the environmental outcome and on the reduction levels that that specific price will trigger. Under an emission trading systems, it basically works in under the opposite logic. So you do fix a limit on the quantity of emissions that are allowed, and that in turn will generate a carbon price on those emissions. Again, in a nutshell, to understand the functioning of an emission trading system, a government typically imposes a limit on the total emissions allowed in a specific year, and also in the following years. Regulated companies under an emission trading systems will then need one allowance for each ton of emissions they have released in the atmosphere. The governments can decide to allocate those allowances for free or through an auction system. Regulated entities can trade the excess permits they might have with one another in the carbon marketplace. And having that marketplace and that market-based functioning of an emission trading system is what generates and reveals a price on CO2 emissions. And this is how emission trading systems cap and generate a price on CO2 emissions. If we look at what happened in the ETS space over the last 12 months or so, so looking at the year 2022, we see that the momentum for ETS development and implementation is continuing. We've been writing a report that looks at the state of play in emission trading systems for a decade now. And over the last 10 years, we saw that the overall number of emission trading systems more than doubled worldwide, as well as the quantity of global emissions under an ETS cap, which also more than doubled over the last decade. Emission trading systems worldwide have also survived quite an eventful year characterized by the first ever global energy crisis without showing major disruptions. We will get into this a bit later in the presentation, but we saw price fluctuations as you might expect from a market-based policy. But overall, global emission trading systems have shown a remarkable level of resilience to what was a really major energy crisis. And thanks to that resilience, carbon prices did remain largely unchanged at what were already quite high levels, following up to gains that were made in 2021. And those high price levels, coupled with an increasing use of auctioning as opposed to free allocation in many systems around the world, did result in another record year for the collection of auctioning revenues, and we will also get into this a bit later in the presentation. I also wanted to start by showing you what is the global landscape for the implementation of emission trading systems worldwide. So we have 29 systems in force as of today, and those are the ones in blue. And we have many more systems that are either under consideration or under development at the moment, and those are the ones in the two different shades of green. A couple of quick things worth noting from the map is that emission trading systems either in force already or under development and consideration. What was I saying? Yeah. So I mean, one thing worth noting on the map is that systems really do span the globe and almost every continent. And this was indeed the case a few years ago. So emission trading systems are becoming increasingly the mitigation instrument of choice, also in developing countries to an increasing extent. And the other thing worth noting is that emission trading systems can be implemented at different levels of governance, all the way from international or regional systems, such as the European one, all the way down to many systems that are implemented at the national level, but also further down at the subnational level, as it's the case in China, for example, or for the US states and Canadian provinces. And we do even have a few city-level systems in Japan and in China. As I was mentioning earlier, we didn't get to this situation overnight, but it is a process that is spanning almost 20 years now. It all started with the EU ETS, which was launched all the way back in 2005. And then since then, new emission trading systems came online almost every year, all the way to where we are now. So with the 29 systems in force, that jointly cover 17% of the global emissions. As a pure stat, is also worth noting that 1/3 of the global population now lives under ETS in force, and jurisdictions making up for 55% of the global GDP are using an emission trading system to cover part of their emissions. The coverage of emission trading systems can differ quite a lot. There's no single blueprint for how to develop an ETS, and given that different sectors have different profiles in different countries, different ETS regulators opt to cover different sectors when they design their system. Typically, the industrial and power sector are obvious candidates for an ETS, because those are sectors where you have a few large sources of emissions and also relatively cheap abatement options. But if you look at this slide, you will see that a number of systems also cover sectors beyond just power and industry, all the way to the building and transport sector, for example, which will be covered by the upcoming EU ETS 2 in Europe, for example, all the way to domestic aviation, the waste sector, forestry, and even a part of the agricultural sector emission, which are covered in some systems. A quick note on prices, because I promised to get back to this point earlier on. On the left-hand side of the slide, you will see historical prices from 2008 to 2022, and then the right-hand side of the slide is a zoom in 2022. What is worth noting here is that after a decade or so of relatively low prices across the board, which basically followed the 2008 financial crisis, emission trading allowance prices in emission trading systems have been rising in the last 3 years or so, and especially in 2021 they made significant gains. This was thanks to more ambition being put on the table and to reforms that strengthened the operation of many different systems across the world, including the European one. In 2022, as I said earlier, the year was characterized by a global energy crisis, which did cause price fluctuations in almost every systems, but overall prices remained stable. And again, this is a strong sign of resilience for global emission trading systems, and not something that could be taken for granted if you look at how things played out in previous major disruptions, such as the COVID pandemic or the 2008 financial crisis. Ending my presentation on revenues, as I said, high carbon prices combined with an increasing use of auctioning as an allocation method in more and more emission trading systems did produce record level of auction revenues in 2021 and also in 2022 last year. And overall, the global total of auctioning revenues collected in emission trading systems is becoming quite significant. So since 2008, when auctioning was first introduced in the world of emission trading systems, more than 220 billions of US dollars were raised, and out of this, roughly a quarter, so 63 billion was raised in 2022 alone. And you will also see from the bar chart that the amount of revenues has been raising dramatically over the last couple of years, especially. The pie chart is a zoom in 2022, and there you can see which systems are generating more revenues. And again, those are systems where you will find a combination of high prices and an extensive use of auctioning. So that is mainly in the EU ETS, in the German national ETS, and in the UK ETS. Revenues are quite important because they can be used by governments for a few different purposes, including helping expose parts of the population to higher energy costs or to higher carbon costs by providing rebates or relief measures that can mitigate distributional impacts of carbon pricing. They can be used similarly to protect covered entities from excessive energy prices, for example, or they can be also used to fund innovation or to further climate action in areas not directly covered by an emission trading systems. And also in the communication around the acceptability of carbon pricing, revenues are gaining increasing importance as a way to promote public acceptance of carbon pricing instruments. So in that sense, it is quite important that emission trading systems are generating an increasing amount of auctioning. I'll leave it to that for the time being. I do have one additional slide that goes a bit more in the context of the energy crisis, but I'm also happy to leave it for the discussion part in case people are interested. Lorenzo or Daniele, back to you.
Thank you, Stefano. Very interesting presentation, very informative, a lot of input. So I don't know if somebody has already some question for Stefano. I see some in the chat. Willie, you want to open the microphone and
Okay, thank you, Daniele. Yes, I just wonder over the supply chain issues. I know that more than 98% of the companies in Europe, or at least in EU, is SMEs, and I know that most of the large companies have much more emissions in their supply chain than they have on their own side. So how is that factor or issues addressed by the ETS systems?
Yes, a very good point, and it's relevant not just for the EU ETS, but for any system, and it's really down to the emission profile in the sectors covered, as well as I mean, it obviously has to do with the design choices behind an ETS. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that even though, as you point out, 98% of companies might be small or medium enterprises, the emissions, especially in the power sector or in the industrial sector, tend to be clustered around a relatively small number of large emitters. And what emission trading systems tend to do is to really try to regulate those big emitters without imposing an unnecessary burden on small enterprises. So typically, you would have a threshold above which you are mandated to comply with the ETS, and that threshold is usually set at a level whereby it basically captures most of the sectoral emission without imposing an undue burden on small companies. So, for example, if I'm not mistaken, in the EU ETS, the threshold is a capacity one, so it works on the basis of installed capacity as opposed to a level of yearly emissions, for example. And I think it's around 25,000 megawatts of installed capacity in power installations or in industry.
Thank you, Daniele, and thank you, Stefano, for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. My question is, how do you perceive the voluntary markets will come with the Article 6.4 mechanism? So what do you think will happen with the voluntary markets when the Article 6.4 mechanism is operating properly?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think we could spend hours talking about this issue. It's obviously a really hot topic in the carbon pricing discussion right now. I think there will be relatively big changes in the voluntary carbon market going forward, mainly because back in the day, or like pre-Paris Agreement, so to speak, the voluntary carbon market used to operate in the non-regulated market, in the non-regulated space that was basically left out of the Kyoto Protocol. Whereas now, under the Paris Agreement, all countries have an obligation or an NDC, and they will have a reduction target. So one thing that the voluntary market will have to understand is how it can play a role in that context, basically in a context where all countries have targets, which can be a challenge for the voluntary market on the supply side, because more and more sectors, for example, will be regulated, and it might be harder to demonstrate additionality for reduction projects in those sectors. And at the same time, there will also be challenges, or at least differences, on the demand side, because basically the space left to the voluntary market to operate is beyond what companies are mandated to do for in compliance with the regulation. And the compliance space is also expanding. If you look at the expansion of emission trading systems, if you look at the expansion of carbon taxes and other forms of carbon pricing. So I think the voluntary market will have to figure out how to basically work hand in hand with the compliance carbon markets, and basically it will have to figure out what kind of role it can play in a space where compliance will be more and more predominant, so to speak.
Thank you, Stefano.
In terms of comparison of the market, we noted that there is a trend of growing of price of CO2 emission. At the same time, there is an important difference between Europe and the other countries. So do you think this is a good indicator, is enough as indicator in terms to compare the ambition? Because, you know, now we have CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and there is also the need to understand if several countries are the same level of ambitious or not. Do you think the price is enough?
It's a tough one. So I mean, like for one thing, the difference in carbon prices can be explained by, you know, design choices behind how these instruments are developed. It can be explained by the maturity of these systems. I mean, all systems tend to start with low prices at the beginning, and then they get reformed to increase prices over time. I mean, if you look at the left side of the slide, the EU ETS had prices that hovered around €5 a ton for almost a decade, and then it was reformed, and then prices went up. So again, different levels of maturity also generate different prices. But most importantly, prices also depend on what kind of role the ETS has in the policy mix. You know, in Europe, at least on paper, the EU ETS, it is meant to be the primary tool for decarbonization in those sectors. And so it is meant to have high prices that drive decarbonization. In California, for example, you do have a whole basket of different measures that target different sectors, and the ETS there is conceived to be almost like, or something like of a backstop measure or a residual measure that you know, basically ensures that emissions are still under a cap, but the heavy lifting for decarbonization is done by different policies. And so in that context, it's not surprising that it has lower prices than in Europe. And when you talk about comparability, next to all of this, I think one additional thing that has to be kept in mind is that you cannot compare carbon pricing one-to-one across different jurisdictions, because obviously the effect that carbon prices have pretty much depend on what the abatement opportunities look like in you know, in different countries and in different sectors. So the effectiveness and the ambition of a system or of a policy is not directly correlated to the price that the policy generates. And yeah, I mean, that is a tricky one for CBAM, obviously.
Exactly, because maybe you have a similar level of ambition, but if the price is different, then the problem of competition remain a key topics. Any other comments in the wide? One insight. Do you know any update on the progress of the idea to include transportation and buildings in the ETS?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I'll talk a little bit about this slide. I mean, as you can see, the EU ETS, which is here on the right side, at the moment includes a power industry and domestic aviation. At the same time, you have some countries in Europe that implemented state level, so national systems to cover emissions that were not covered by the EU ETS, and most notably, these are emissions that are currently under the effort sharing regulation in Europe. So emissions, for example, for the transport and building sectors. And so, for example, you have Germany that a couple of years ago launched a national system to cover emissions from those sectors. Austria also followed up last year. Finland had similar plans. And at the same time, the discussion started in Europe as part of the Fit for 55 package about developing a second ETS, so a separate one that would cover emissions from the transport and building sector. And that was approved together with the rest of the Fit for 55 package. And it is currently undergoing implementation phase. So the idea there is that in 2027, or there's an option to pause it until 2028, A second ETS will be introduced at the European level to cover emission from fuel use in the transport and the building sector. So differently from the main ETS, it will be an upstream ETS. So it will target importers and distributors of fossil fuel used in the transport and building sector. But it will work alongside the first ETS to basically cap emissions at the European level in those two sectors.
Okay. I don't see any further comments. But at the same time, it's also already 5:30. So let me remember which are the next appointment that he will have with the T corner. And the next T corner will be last week of August, to be on ISCCU as tool for the compliance to the requirement of RED II directive. So it is in direction of the use of renewable sources. But before the 27th of July, we will have a workshop. So workshop is not a T-corner, it's a half day of event, including often a verification body, consultant company. In this case, we'll have a very interesting, I suppose, workshop with the representative of them, the World Benchmark Alliance, on the ACT step-by-step methodology to facilitate the integration of strategy in the company in direction of mitigation and decarbonization. So yes, I think it's all for today. So thank you so much, everybody, for the participation to our T corner, and in particular to Stefano for very, very excellent, very interesting explanation. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you. Ciao, Stefano.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao, Stefano.
Bye bye.
Thanks and
Bye bye. Thank you, everybody.
thanks.